Hey guys, it's me, Sigmund Freud. We
Hi.
have stock image of our ad, been working very hard on the 400 subscriber special. This is not the 400 subscriber special. I hate to break it to you. If you want a clip of it, here's one now. Got it? Alright, that's great. Also, be warned, there will be spoilers for you. This is a you video all about you. So, if you don't know the show, or if you want to watch it but don't want to get spoiled, I guess just leave and watch the other mukbangs, not mine. Totally different guy. Alright, good? Alright, yeah.
Girl. You wrote the story. All I did was bring it to life. The story was perfect. So everyone believed it.
You is a show that is obsessed with romanticizing tragedies. It is at the core of every season, every relationship Joe's had, down to the final montage in season 5. With each season outdoing itself in terms of focusing in on all those themes as Joe goes through his romantic cycles and the internal conflicts in between. It was perfectly applied, and when watching, I felt like I was getting dragged into a tale that completely subverts your expectations with every season. It's bold, and when it was like a gust of wind, guiding me into a completely different direction to what I thought, and I look forward into that new direction, and I see the horrors within. Even in the new writers for season 5, I felt like we're aware and knew that they had to apply these themes perfectly in order to actually give the show and Joe such a bold ending. What's even more fascinating is how the show uses this to reflect back on us, how we glamorize pain through the stories we tell ourselves to cope with the tragedies that we unconsciously turn into fantasies. Due to that, you felt tightly controlled, and because of it, it's not just telling a story, it's exposing cycles that we partake in without us even realizing it. And I believe it's something worth digging into because it's such a majestic thing of beauty. There's a false sense of self-improvement, and that just shows that people would romanticize tragedies in order to feel a false sense of control, change, and moral superiority without actually changing. Instead of confronting themselves and their purpose or goal, people would rather project their insecurities onto other activities that feel like change is being made or they're productive when really they're not. And you see this with Joe, who perfectly captures this, by the way. With every new relationship and identity, he convinces himself that he's changed, he's regained control, and, he's got the fresh start. Yet he never actually addresses the root of his problems, which is himself. And due to that, each illusion collapses or relationship just falls apart, and it forces him to go back to the same romantic cycle. Again, these 7 of his girlfriends, holy. And this pattern isn't even just limited to Joe, but also towards the audience as well. As as he always says, maybe it's you. And again, this can be seen through limerence, the intense state of obsessive infatuation often caused by a lack of self-esteem. Instead of confronting personal emptiness or tragedy or your low self-esteem, people would rather cling on to these idealized objects of desire, much like Joe does with his partners, mistaking fixation for growth. This shows that the illusion of control makes stagnation feel productive. However, Bronte's friends reinforce this idea in the final montage of the show when they said that they're going after more people like Joe and just treating Joe more like a broken myth, a story, rather than dismantling the foster system that allowed Joe to exist in the first place, turning structural failure into a personal spectacle just to feel a bit more morally righteous avoiding anything deeper. Basically distracting themselves in this activity by romanticizing an entire murder case just to have the idea of feeling morally superior in that they're making this huge movement. Basically, just all in all, Joe and Bronte's friends just perfectly show that romanticized tragedies sell a comforting story that you are evolving, you are changing, when in all actuality, you're just learning new ways to say the same. And when it comes to giving a comforting story, Joe's over-dramatic suicide attempt at the very end of season 4 is the ultimate expression of it. It highlights the consequences of mythologizing and how it replaces accountability, destruction, and becomes basically a way to feel morally superior and redeemed. Again, final episode, Joe kills Kate's dad, him and his imaginary friend Reese go up to the bridge where Joe and Reese have this overly emotional conversation about ending things. Reese is trying to convince him not to, while Joe's like,
And it ends with a corpse in the trunk of my car, over and over.
And instead of actually trying to take accountability and turn himself into the cops, he decides to, take control and try to kill himself. He gets to choose his fate, and I think that perfectly illustrates Joe's romanticizing his own tragedy as, again, he gets to take full control. He gets to choose his fate by giving himself the ending he wants, to feel good about himself, feeling redeemed that he did the right thing this one time and ending the cycle and turning the deaths into a final act of authorship. Essentially, it just seems that Joe could not survive without mythologizing himself. Joe, why? And again, he does this repeatedly throughout the story, through the literary projections throughout the show. I think there is multiple examples of this. He has Bluebeard, or if you again remember final episode in Tobias Wolf's story, A Bullet in the Brain, he just does that. He always projects stories into his life. And I think there is no other greater example than with the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde and Reese's memoir. This whole story about the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde is about moral and self-division. And like Jekyll, Joe sees himself as separate from all the other violence he commits, externalizing his actions into a second persona, Reese, and it's being shaped by Joe, and it's only Reese because of Joe's shaped envy and insecurity from the Reese's memoir, since they have similar backstories, and it just echoes Dr. Nikki's whole and Reese and Joe that season just echo Dr. Nikki's early claim about there being two Joes. I think they perfectly fit that description, and it just shows that Joe needs to control. He just needs to feel control in order to function, and he does this through those stories that he externalizes as he's killing people. So he doesn't have to actually confront himself. He just glamorizes his kills through symbolic narratives of stories he embodies. These traits of Joe highlight how romanticized tragedy becomes a tool of control, allowing him to frame violence as growth and self-destruction as a way to redeem himself, or as a way of getting the fresh start, rather than actually confronting the reality of who he is and what he actually did throughout the show. And one's tragedy has become a tool for the fantasy of growth. It can be weaponized outwards. And Joe doesn't just use these romanticized stories to absolve himself of guilt or the fantasy of growing or being productive. He just also uses them to control people. And that's like his whole thing. He stalks them as well, and he reshapes reality to whatever he wants to believe in at the time. And you see this throughout the show as he frames his relationships as these romantic novels he'd probably read at Mooney's. Casting himself as the white knight who cleans houses back to clean house. And that's helped him. And also the girlfriends become
for the wrong men.
Damsel in
Bad
distress,
men.
and this helps him actually get with them each and every time and time again. But they always fail. But they always fail because he doesn't take care of himself. And what he does is that he uses that to rewrite the ending, and those failed romances become necessary plot points, and just using and this is definitely noticeable during the fabricated suicide notes, and using them as narrative devices designed to misdirect the attention of others to preserve his self-image, and in order for him to not get caught, of course. And just the goal was never accountability but control, and making others to look away of what actually matters in the moment. And here's the thing. This obsession with control has never been more prevalent than in the show's actual finale, the final episode, and during the confrontation between Joe and Bronte, the final clash. Obviously after the fire at Moody's, and just watching it, I felt like two narcissists were trying to gravitate you to their narrative, ego versus ego, and Bronte winning that interaction allowed her to rewrite the ending, basically, making she pretty much puts
Joe Goldberg was made to see
Joe's
all
trial
of himself.
as just the trial was messy. It was a huge missed opportunity, and she makes all the victims just kind of the actual
Although I
joke,
suspect
just
the
kind of
real reason the
minimized
public
into
turned
the
on him is
background.
that I
And she
accidentally
centers
turned him
herself-
into a walking dick joke.
Yeah, she just centers herself in Joe's entire story, replacing justice with performance as the victims become aesthetic background. And in doing so, she just romanticizes, again, an entire
After
murder
him,
case of Joe,
every day that
rather than
passes,
actually dismantling
he
it and just
shrinks.
absorbing the
Eventually,
real
he'll just be
suffering
some
into
asshole I
a new
dated.
fantasy centered on her moral performance. And this idea of getting absorbed into a far greater narrative is paralleled from Bronte to Joe's portrayal in season 5. At the end of season 4, after nearly drowning, Joe convinces himself that he's accepted all the parts about himself as he represses any moral conflict or redemption or whatever Jonathan Moore was talking about. It just embraces the Mr. Hyde and Reese Montrose side of himself as he becomes hollow, less tragic romantic and more of a typical serial killer in season 5, and also just being more animalistic, and as he just creates more of these shitty murder fan fictions with no pretense to grow, or at least any actual interest in growing. And here's the kicker: Joe's behavior is not that special. He mirrors how society handles tragedy at a large scale. You just look at what happened shortly after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You have people like the U.S. Congressman Troy Nels claiming that Kirk would have been
He'd have
Jesus
been the
Christ's
13th
disciple had he
lived in the biblical times.
and all the other people claiming that Kirk is a martyr. This is rhetoric at work as genre and the rhetorical writing situation shapes tragedy to elicit a specific emotional response, such as telling a joke should make you laugh at like a rhetorical level. Nels framing Kirk as a religious myth designed to mobilize Kirk's death shortly after his assassination, makes Kirk's identity get absorbed into this far greater narrative to just rally a desired audience, showing how tragedies get morphed into these rhetorical tools which dehumanize people, becoming instruments for someone else's message. Something that makes romanticized tragedy so much more compelling is that it grants people the idea of something that they feel they're missing, a void that they need to fill. And this is apparent with Joe, as most if not all of Joe's relationships have just stemmed from his relationship from his emotionally unavailable mother. Joe just seeks the affection that he never got from his mom by stalking, controlling, and idealizing women and using romance as a substitute for the love that he lacked in childhood. And his savior complex, like need I remind you, pretty much just came from the incident between him and his dad and his mom getting put in the foster care system. But I digress here, as in season 3, Joe uses his newly born son Henry as a narrative tool rather than a reason for genuine change. Instead of actually confronting the root cause of that violent cycle again himself, Joe reframes fatherhood as evidence that he has changed, he has grown, and again, fresh start. And he does this through focusing on Henry's living space, then the behaviors that make Henry repeat the same thing that Joe doesn't want. In other words, Joe basically romanticizes the tragedy of his own life, his own crybaby backstory, to partake in controlling others in order to satisfy the void that was left by him through his mother and his father, and just his whole childhood, using the company of others to help his issues instead of confronting them himself. And that idea of using others is big in the final season. They do this through the vampire analogies throughout the season. You have Clayton talking about
people are opening up veins in here, you know. No vampires.
Yeah,
like you have to read your own work and no vampires allowed. You have Joe's taser marks by Bronte, which look like vampire bites, or Joe having blood all over his mouth, or Joe heavily editing Beck's novel to be a bestseller using someone else's work to make something of your own. And it just makes Joe function as this literary vampire. And it's also mirrored through Bronte especially, which is most evidenced through her rewriting the entire trial that was built up throughout the entire show to be centered around her. You also have her taking a pen name off of famous creative women, or being Beck's TA. And just together, these moments reveal how romanticized tragedy offers the grand vision of filling an emotional void without any accountability. Joe uses tragedy to compensate for the love he never got through control, while Bronte uses it to secure relevance through authorship. And in both cases, tragedy becomes this resource, mined, reshaped, and consumed, rather than something to be confronted or resolved. In contrast to Joe's personal attempts at filling voids, military recruitment advertisements demonstrate how institutions will deliberately romanticize tragedy in order to attract audiences. I remember this video made by the official British Army Jobs channel, and it was this advertisement that presents the army as a source of belonging rather than confronting the brutality of war. The video is called This Is Belonging, by the way, and by selling the idea of brotherhood instead of and kind of covering up the violence, the ad transforms the tragedy of warfare into this tale of community and identity. And the strategy works precisely because audiences already are familiar with the past ideal stories of camaraderie, and these fantasies are then shaped by past cultural narratives. Similarly, it is close to Joe's childhood absence of love informing his future behavior. Recruitment campaigns rely on shared histories of brotherhood to make enlistment feel meaningful, and in both cases, genre is reshaped to serve a goal, and tragedy is reframed as purpose. And Joe seeks relationships to compensate for the emotional absence of his mom, where recruitment ads offer a ready-made belonging to individuals to feel disconnected in their everyday lives. And when people do not confront the root of their personal or collective suffering, such as isolation or lack of purpose, they become more susceptible to portrayals that glamorize pain. And military recruitment ads exploit this vulnerability by emphasizing unity and brotherhood while obscuring the violence of warfare, shaping destructive realities into appealing stories of identity. Together, these examples reveal how romanticized narratives convert tragedy into an illusion of connection and control, making the suffering they depend upon. So overall, You as a show presents that romanticized tragedy works as distractions to make us believe we're on a path towards redemption or development or productivity through the stories we tell ourselves and project onto others. Joe's obsession with control, meaning, and redemption exposes how easily tragedies can be transformed into a performance rather than a catalyst for change. By romanticizing suffering, he avoids the vulnerability of accountability, choosing authorship over self-confrontation. And the series challenges the viewer to consider how often they too seek meaning through fantasy instead of action or clarity and reflection. How tragedy is consumed, aestheticized, or repurposed to feel purposeful, when tragedies become stories to be molded rather than reality to be confronted. Growth stagnates and decays. So how do we reduce romanticizing tragedy? Here's the thing. True change comes from enduring inconvenient truths and facing them head on rather than being comforted by rewritten pain. The final conversation between Joe and Henry, which is, in my opinion, one of the best scenes in the show, is a good example of this by stripping away the mythology perfectly. The biggest thing that went through Joe's head during that final episode, to me, was Henry telling Joe that he's the monster. No narrative, no closure, no redemption. Only recognizing Joe for what he is within that specific moment, and the fantasy got replaced by clarity. Joe wasn't undone by hatred or getting caught by Bronte or the cops. It was the unfiltered statement about who he is, exposing the biggest failure of romanticized suffering, which is that it protects the self at the expense of truth. Reducing tragedy then would require resisting the urge to mythologize pain, questioning not only the systems that reward the spectacle and narrative control, but also the internal stories that we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. No matter what Joe, Bronte, or Bronte's friends, or just what anyone has done, tragedy is at its most dangerous when it's aestheticized rather than examined critically. You then also argues that growth comes from ending rewrites of the story by confronting the reality as is in the present without fantasies, authorship, and or escape. Thank you very much.